Every day we're bombarded with ideas, opinions, information, and misinformation, all of which only makes things more confusing. But amidst all the noise, there are voices worth listening to. People who have spent years, sometimes lifetimes, trying to understand the human experience. Experts who may not have all the answers, but who ask better questions than most. That's why we made this show. It's a podcast where we invite the world's leading experts to talk about matters that matter. A space for long, honest conversations about the human condition, philosophy, psychology, meaning, suffering, joy, the mind, and today, death. We discuss what happens when we die. How do we make sense of something so inevitable yet so scary? Here's our podcast host, Mike, to take us on a beautiful journey, the journey of death.
Hello and welcome to the Aperture Podcast. Here at Aperture, we recently completed work on a long-form deep dive into the various ways religion has been used and abused throughout the ages to exploit the faith of followers. It got us thinking about the underlying reasons why religion has such a powerful grip on the human psyche. One of the most obvious, you might say cynical reasons, is because religion helps us grapple with death. As Joseph Campbell once noted, man is the only creature that consciously knows we are going to die, and religion is one of the very few tools that can help us make sense of that and offer some sort of promise that death might not be the end. Death is obviously a very taboo subject and not something we typically like to think about, but we decided to lean into the subject of death, and we decided the best place to start was with a woman who has been helping people die for well over a decade, who has advocated for end-of-life rights in the California legislature, and who has been profiled on NPR and the Los Angeles Times, amongst many other places. I am speaking of Jill Schock, a death doula. Jill, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I think most of us know what a doula is. It's somebody, if you want to have more, maybe they do, maybe they don't. Women who want to have a more natural childbirth would have. Maybe if you want to have birth at home, or you just don't want to do a classic hospital birth, would have a doula. Death doula is something we're less familiar with. What is a death doula?
I mean, I think it's a really good using. The image of a birth doula is actually really good for people who haven't heard about it before, because like a birth doula might carry a woman through pregnancy to term, through the birth, and then do postpartum work, I would work with people who learn that they have a terminal diagnosis, walk them through their hospice experience, their death, and then grief work afterwards.
Death is something most of us would prefer to not think about. Are we right to be afraid of death?
Not afraid, but I think there is, you mentioned Joseph Campbell, and it goes kind of back further than that. There's a great philosopher named Soren Kierkegaard, which is like one of the first people to point out that it's a part of our unique consciousness as humans, to be aware of our death, and that causes both dread and awe kind of at the same time. So this idea was picked up maybe like 100 years later, right? Because no one wants to talk about it, by Ernest Becker. And he writes the book, The Denial of Death, which basically explains that we kind of have to carry this healthy fear or denial, or we would go crazy.
Yes.
We have to create an identity, meaningful stuff, names, relationships, religions, cultures, things like that to keep us sane.
So, should we be afraid of death?
No, I think death is easier than people think. I think the thing to be afraid of is suffering.
Okay. Can you describe your religious background? I think you have some religious training of a sort, and to what extent, if any, it informs your current work.
Yeah. So I have a master's degree from Vanderbilt Divinity School. So I spent some time, I suppose, in a seminary-like setting. But my study was more about how humans make meaning when life is interrupted by crisis, illness, or death. So I was less on the biblical and preacher side of the theological education that I was more in philosophical meaning making and clinical experience. So I guess that might put me in a more spiritual bracket, but I am a clinical chaplain by trade.
Do you see a through line?
Yeah, I think so.
How would you describe the through line?
I mean, it kind of depends on what part of the country you're in, right? Because we have different religious views and different cultural settings. So I think the through line is people wanting to hold on to something that helps them make meaning, whether that's a deity, a church, or if it's just the cosmos, or something simple like being in the ocean or something like that. So however you connect to something that seems higher than yourself would be a through line.
How does one get into this line of work?
I think you have to experience death.
So then you would describe it as a calling.
Yeah, I would. And I would say that most people who are in this work would also describe it that way.
So most people, at least currently, do not use death doulas for themselves or within their families. What is it about the traditional, let's say, Western or American practice of dying and facing death that you find lacking?
Well, there's two sides to death and dying, right? There's the clinical side, so what you experience on the healthcare end, and then there's the funeral care side. And you kind of get wedged between these two systems, and a lot of people really get swept down the river. I think there's a lot of difficulty now, especially with cancer and the evolving technology of cancer, of where do you draw the line with your quality of life? That's been a really big struggle lately. Mm-hmm. And then,
you mean being technically alive versus still being really living, capable of living with a quality of life that most of us would consider a baseline for it sort of being worth staying alive.
Right.
Yeah. Does everybody need a death doula?
I would say yes. Mm-hmm. I think it's a really good tool to have, especially because, working between these two industries, they're kind of stuck in their own box.
Yeah.
You really need someone who's willing to work in the gray area and help you on both ends, be a true advocate for you. So doulas are paid directly by the client. So I have an obligation to you, to work directly for you and make sure you get what you want. Otherwise, like I said earlier, just getting swept down that river, people lose a lot of power. They lose a lot of money as well,
How do you mean that?
Well, doulas, even though they're an out-of-pocket expense, they can help you save money, especially on the funeral end of things.
How so?
Well, the funeral industry is wrought with overpricing, and it has been for a very long time. In fact, there's really only one regulation that's placed on them, and it was only placed there in 1984.
Which is? The
general pricing list. So they have to show you their prices up front, and that can't change. Because before they do a switcheroo, in the end. And
like the thing where you go to the car dealer and you think you know the payment, and then they keep you sitting around for half of the day, and by the end it's 30% higher, and you're like, I've been here, I may as well just sign the thing.
Yeah, exactly. Or you don't want to give your loved one, cheap care.
Right.
But the truth is they still make up those prices. So if you are dealing with the decision of a $12,000 casket or getting care for mom before she dies, doulas can say, why don't we do a cremation, save you $12,000 and get mom that care she needs before. So boom, there's a flip in how you're using the money.
Yeah. Well, that's assuming you can get the mom on board with that. Now, there's a huge generational thing here, which you must see. Well, that's a question. To what extent do you deal with clients who want you to work with them, and how many of them are people who want you to work with their parents or their elders? I would imagine generationally there's a radical difference there. I can imagine having a death doula myself. I can't imagine suggesting it to my parents.
Yeah, so I would say the front part of my career, because I started in 2009, was dealing with the greatest generation, right? So they were way more difficult. It was easier for me to function in the capacity of a chaplain because things were still more religious, I would say. And now that we're opening up to the boomers, or what some might call the silver tsunami, I see more creativity and openness and a desire to show who they are. I mean, this is the generation of civil rights, rock and roll, summer of love. Like, they don't want to be like their parents that are super traditional. They're actually really fun. And their kids, it's 50-50 who kind of comes to me. But their kids are also really creative and have good relationships most of the time with their parents if they're calling someone like me to get involved.
Fun was not an adjective I was expecting you to use.
It can be fun.
How can it be fun?
If people get in touch with the reality of death, and this is why I call myself a death doula. I don't sugarcoat it, because if you're coming to me, we're working with death, right?
Do people come to you saying, well, I know it's inevitable, so let's start a relationship now, or is it more often, I've got the diagnosis?
I've got the diagnosis.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I need people to have that in order to move forward.
I see.
Because I can't work with you for years. I can only work with you in a short period of time.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
getting back to the fun part.
The fun. Yeah, so if you have the time and the awareness, you can actually design something that's really unique to you, like having a party before you die. Yeah. Those change the whole game, because psychologically, both the dying person and the people that they love get to say goodbye.
Right. Which is, I was always raised to believe I was raised in a very traditional Irish Catholic family, and there was wakes and everything. When you're a kid, I don't want to go near the coffin. It looks weird. And the mantra that was always repeated is, it's not for the dead person, it's for the living to make their peace with to see them one last time. Surely what you are suggesting, although it can see where it's uncomfortable of a thought at first, is better than the practices we currently have of going down to a funeral home and seeing.
I mean, yes, and it depends on the funeral home, right? Because most funeral homes will encourage and upsell embalming. Yeah. So they're trying to create something that they've dubbed the memory picture. And as soon as you give your body to a funeral home, they dictate the memory picture. So that might come with embalming, that might come with makeup, cosmeticize, the natural form of the body, which some people could view as healing, some people could view as disrespectful.
Sure, you could make that argument. I cannot believe I've made it this far into my own personal life without having a death truly close to me, a close friend or an immediate family member. In the most simple and direct terms, what is death like?
Shattering. It's almost like, you take off those rose-colored glasses, and
so I feel like you're answering from the point of view of which was the spirit in which I meant it, to the loved ones around them.
Yeah.
Okay. So keep going.
Yes, and with the dying person, it never becomes real until it's real. So we as livers, won't feel that feeling until it's true. I think going back to the denial of death, it protects us from that.
Yes.
And it's sort of like a woman about to give birth, or like, okay, it's go time. I think the dying person has a really similar rush of thoughts and energy.
I see. Right. They say very often with women that biology tricks them into thinking after they have their first child that it was bad, but it wasn't that bad. Because if they truly remembered, nobody would have a second child.
That's true.
That observation has been made. So it does set in. You think typically with your clients, there is a moment where, how do they express that?
People know the truth and they express it in different ways. They might never say it out loud. They might be fully open about it with everyone they meet, making everyone uncomfortable. So I
know some of those. Yeah.
Yeah. So it depends on the person and how they want to express their coping.
Yeah. What is a good death, and on the other side of the coin, what is a bad death?
It's tricky because I think there is a fantasized version of death, right, that we come across in Hollywood, or if you've never seen a death before, you don't know about the little gurgles and, things that happen that are natural but potentially disturbing. So I think a good death would be dictated by the person who's dying, whatever that looks like. And that can be really hard because it's their picture, not ours.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that? What would be their picture? What would be it, for example?
Well, people can choose how long they go and like, you know, get treatment or take medication for comfort or not, you know, so depending on what choices they make earlier on, it might dictate how their body goes through the death labor. And I think it's important because people will say, well, I wish they would have done this, or why won't they take the morphine, or why are they taking too much? You know, you just have to let them lead. And I think that's a good death, no matter what it looks like to us, which is a really difficult concept too.
Did you have much experience with the actual nuts and bolts of experiencing people dying before you leapt into this line of work?
I grew up in a German apostolic church where we always did open caskets, and we even had services for the dead in cemeteries. So I was really familiar with death and dying and, you know, praying for souls and whatnot. So I think that was a part of my education. I also got my hands on probably some books that weren't age appropriate when I was young. Like I was reading Holocaust books and Edgar Allan Poe when I was like 8. So I had
So you're kind of just a professional goth?
An inclination, yeah. I had a goth phase for sure.
Gotcha. Yeah. Loud and clear.
But yeah.
Yeah, sure. All right. How do you, as much as, you know, you obviously have some core memories of being open to this, in touch with this, comfortable with this in a way that the average person isn't, still you have your own personal life to lead. How do you not take your work home with you at the end of the day, or do you?
I don't. I think after 16 years, you learn how to compartmentalize, but also you value what's important, relationships, how they play out in your life, what truly brings you happiness, how you make money, where you live, you know, what you spend your money on. You know, it's like, you know, for me, I love food and beverage. I love vacations. I love dinner with friends. Like it's, you know, those moments, I really do make them matter, because I could get a diagnosis today. I could have something going on right now. And, you know, this is all we have, what's in front of us, really.
Some people will tell you that when it comes to death, it is harder typically for the family than it is for the individual. You're nodding your head. You find that to be true. To what extent is that true, and how?
I think it's harder, the hardest thing for the dying person, because I really do think slipping into death is fairly easy and comfortable. But I think it's hardest for the dying person to leave their loved ones. And you'll find that people will actually linger in their unconscious dying phase. So after they're, you know, looks like they're in a deep sleep, you know, they still have these strong energetic attachments to people who love them. And sometimes if someone's like at the bedside the whole time, like, okay, maybe let's take a break and see if we can give them the space to not be holding on to your energetic attachment. And that's when they go. Or vice versa, you know, they wait till someone gets there, the plane lands, they rush in the room, and then they go, you know. So it really kind of depends on the dying person. But of course, it's hard to watch someone you love die. I think the concept of separation physically forever on both ends is difficult.
And I don't want to ask this question, but I can't help but ask this question. What happens? What change? Is there a physical change that overtakes the body sort of instantly at the moment?
When someone takes their last breath? Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting, because they'll take so in the final moments of death, they're experiencing something called apnea. We've all heard of sleep apnea.
Yes. So
there's gaps between the breaths. So usually if we're witnessing that, we'll see longer pauses. And so there's kind of this, will they, won't they? And then when they don't, there's like this in-between breath of waiting. And then there's the realization. And then you can start to see the body change color almost instantly. And you can almost, sometimes they'll let out a final sigh, or sometimes they won't, but you can almost see this like the word I want to use is deadening. And it's like, they're dead. Like if you covered up 3 bodies or whatever, and like 1 was dead and 2 were alive, you could probably energetically feel which one wasn't there. And you get that sense of that person is gone after someone takes their last breath.
Right. So the language that we still use is someone has passed away. You're saying that person is gone. We never say that person is over. Right. And
Game over.
That person ended. When let's, we can speculate about what happens to us after we die. That's a possibility. You were and you are no more. What is your personal opinion in regard to the existence of a soul? And of course, how does your work inform that? Because that would be the most obvious. That would be any religious person would be screaming at their speaker or their screen right now. Well, dummy, yes, that's the soul leaving the body, and you're seeing the shell or whatever word you want to use.
The soul and or consciousness, it kind of depends on how you categorize those things. I don't know. I'm more of a William James type seeker.
Okay, explain that.
Well, I'm constantly looking at more things, like the more, what's coming, like what am I noticing, what am I observing, very pragmatic. So my opinions on what happens changes a lot, but there is a common mystic type stream within my work that before people die, they do experience quite a bit, which is in line very much with near-death experiences.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about all this sorts of things.
Sure.
Okay.
So at this moment, I'm looking at NDEs and this process that the dying go through and kind of think they're in the same category. I still don't know what happens to people after.
You don't even have if you don't have a firm conviction, how are any of the rest of us supposed to?
That's a part of the work.
So, I mean, you've already answered my question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you feel like you can see, is there any part of you that feels like you can see a soul leaving the body?
Yeah, I think that process.
Okay, and how would you describe that?
Yeah, just that physicality of, and it's also a feeling. Like you can feel it. Like I've had clients, I had a client and their spouse in the room, and when they took their final breath, their wife also passed out. That's kind of how tangible the feeling is of that consciousness or breath or soul, whatever you want to call it, is leaving the body. So you can feel it. Something is happening, but what it is, I think that's up to interpretation.
Have you been present for someone who experienced or claimed to experience a near-death experience?
Yes.
Okay, so can you talk about that?
Yeah, more than I used to work in a cardiac ICU and on a stroke ward. So in those two settings, you do have people who experience, death for a few moments or a few minutes. And I've had people say that they saw, the light and their ancestors and that typical story, like, oh, this is easy, this feels good, but then something pulls them back, whatever it is. It's a purpose, like medicine, whatever.
Yeah, it's not your time yet, right?
It's not, yeah. And that's really magical. And I love those stories. And I've also had people be like, it was black, it was nothing.
Right.
So.
Okay. All right. Well, so there's people saying it's good, it's easier, there's nothing to fear, death is not the end. And then there's people saying I saw nothing. Nobody's at least saying really bad stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I had one gentleman that people often enter like hallucinations or, seeing beyond the veil, if you will. And this one guy, he kept having these visions of like animals, like having a parade for him and like leaving. So that's really pleasant. But there was one night where the animals seemed like a little scarier, so I don't know. I don't know. Just like we have dreams, we have nightmares.
Yes.
I'm sure that's all folded in somehow, but maybe we don't hear about the dark side of it.
Right. Right. That's the most rational explanation, is you're entering a sort of dream state and you're in a dream reality. I've heard anecdotally people say that people who've had parents that, approach death in the house or whatever, saying the daytimes are okay. It's the nights that are, which on a sort of primal level treks.
Yeah.
You know, the thing that even as a child, or sometimes, let's face it, as an adult, the thing that goes bump in the night doesn't bother you during the day. It bothers you at night. Do you think to what extent would you guess the attitude that people have when the line between reality and fantasy or the approaching afterlife is sort of blurring is just informed by their mental state of mind, either the kind of person they've been, an anxious person, an optimistic person, or just where that they have been in, for example, if you knew that you were sick for 5 years and you've had a lot of time to prepare for it and you've done the work versus I was just in a car accident. I was not expecting this to be dying to be my afternoon. It would seem like that's a pretty easy way of explaining why some people have one experience and some have another. It's just how much anxiety, why we have bad dreams when we're taking anxiety from our day into our sleep.
Yeah.
Does that track?
Yeah. And I mean, we'll never really get the stories of people who die instantly, and I can't imagine what their thought process is. It's probably like, no, what the fuck? I don't want to die now. Whereas people have time to be prepared, have an easier process. So, what are the stories that are coming back to the living?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is just salacious stuff, but we're not naming names here. Have you heard any good deathbed confessions?
No, but I do have a really great, I like to collect last words. And yeah, the best one, really cool, very cool guy. He was like a car guy like my dad, and he had a planned death, which is legal in California, and he took the medication and he was just leaning into it, and he kind of went unconscious for a minute, and then he came out of his little dream spell, and he was like, pastrami sandwich, and then he went back and then he died. And me and his daughters just thought that was great, and they wrote me a card later and kind of wrote about that, and that was a really good one.
Yeah, that's exactly, I love a good pastrami sandwich.
Me too.
That's exactly how I want to
respect.
go. Well, that's your book, huh? Famous or just the last words.
Yeah, I take a lot of quotes directly from my clients when I'm working with them. I take handwritten notes, and I write down things that they say.
Yeah. Beyond just the last words, are there particular, and again, you don't want to betray anybody's privacy or confidence, but clients who stay with you in a particular way, and who and why?
I mean, I try not to connect as much as I might have when I was younger. Just for self-preservation. But in particular, I'm more curious about narratives around how people make sense of why this is happening to them. Like I did everything right, or the why me kind of aspect. Yeah. And it's hard to have those conversations and some clients are open to this and some clients will be appalled, but why not you as well? It could be me, it could be you, it could be anybody. One day it will be someone, me. Yeah. So there's no difference from one human to another. It's just a matter of when.
We all stubbornly cling to the notion, even though we know it's not true, that life is quote unquote fair. And,
right.
And it feels like this, if this doesn't feel like my time, and for most people, we're probably never going to say, wow, this would be a great time for me to die. I was professionally acquainted with Larry King. You remember Larry King?
Yeah.
The guy was 110 years old and still hosting 3 TV shows, terrified every night when he went to bed, because it was never going to be his time. He wanted to be wearing suspenders and asking people softball interview questions for 1,000 years.
Yeah. Yeah. That thing that you're saying about being afraid every night is very common with people who are dying. They will avoid sleep.
Yes.
Because they are
I've heard of people avoiding their bed.
Yeah. Their bed, sleep, they'll sit up on the couch or in their lazy boy, but they will avoid sleep because they know that in those, it's like a liminal state that you enter when you're in REM, and you could easily cross over. And they've probably felt that and maybe even toyed with it a little previously. Yeah. And so, like I said, people know the truth. That's why they avoid sleep, because they know it can happen then.
What do you think about euthanasia? It's been in the headlines, the quote unquote suicide pod or death pod in one of the Scandinavian countries. There's some awful controversy, and I don't know how familiar you are with this.
I'm very familiar.
Putting the specifics of that aside, that ought to have no for a rational person ought to have no bearing on what you think in general of should there be. I don't know if humane doesn't seem like a word that typically applies to humans, but a civilized way that we can all sort of, as society, agree this person is making a rational, informed decision. They're not just feeling a little bummed out. It is their time, and we respect their right to choose the time and place and manner of their demise.
Yeah, so different countries, different social attitudes.
Of course.
Right? Canada and Switzerland and the United States have very differing versions of this, because you can have terminal depression or Alzheimer's dementia or, MS and go to a country like, Switzerland and be able to take part in medical aid in dying, where in the United States you need to have an active terminal illness and you can't be compromised in your mind at all. So even if you have a history of depression or something like that, you might not qualify. Or Parkinson's, you're off the list. Or you also have to be physically able to take the medication. So an illness like ALS, which should have direct access to this type of exit, would be forced not to have access to it. So different countries, different laws, and I think those are really dictated around like the social environment that creates those laws.
I'm gathering your personal opinion is you would wish that as a society we could get to a place where we're more like countries. Like that.
I helped get the law passed in Southern California for medical aid in dying.
Tell me about that.
The bill was on with Governor Brown in 2015, and I can't remember which state, but we were, I believe, one of the first 5. It was like Oregon, like in the 90s, and then Washington in like 2008, and then like Colorado and Vermont, and then California or something. So, right now we still have this. People still have a right to die if they have a qualifying terminal illness, and they can just take a drink and go at their own will, which prevents a lot of suffering. It can be that window between unconscious dying and death. Sometimes there's a lot of suffering that take place, and some people just want to skip that, almost like a woman having an epidural, or twilight birthing from back in the day.
Right. You, I would guess, would sometimes be in a challenging position where you have been down this road enough times, that somebody is on their way, they're not going to come back, and now we're just prolonging the inevitable. And I've heard, again, anecdotally, people have these, advanced directives of just don't keep me alive with machines. I don't want, but then when it comes down.
Yeah. So I definitely am a strict follower of advanced directives. Those are legal documents.
Yes.
And, someone can be prosecuted in court by not following those, but many people don't follow up and do that. So people don't understand the weight of potential consequences. And you have to be really careful who you choose as your agent or power of attorney, because they can choose, once you lose capacity, whatever they want. So
it sounds like you've got some sort of horror stories there.
Oh, yeah. It happens all the time.
For, like, what would be for example?
Someone coding and their husband, in an ICU, so coding is like when the heart stops, code blue. And so the whole like resuscitation team comes in and starts chest compressions. And if the family members say like, yes, go intubate, do everything possible, because they're in the moment, and they're a DNR on paper, but the family in that moment can override it. And that's really sad, because CPR is very physical, can be very brutal, and it doesn't bring everybody back, that's for sure. So I've seen it too many times. I've seen people take over care, lock other people out, directly go against the wishes of someone who's, impaired. So this is also a part of death and dying, that people's worst coping mechanisms will come up, and that's what they'll drive with.
Yes.
So you have to be really aware.
Yes, it's a critical time. What is your role after the person has died, assuming you've had some pre-existing relationship with the family, because that's a danger zone.
Yeah.
Families get torn apart, and I'm assuming you don't actually get involved with the reading of wills and all of that, but it's a time in life when people need to make some very mature decisions, and it's a time when their wounds, their emotions are as raw as they could ever possibly be. What is your role? How do you approach helping to navigate the family once your client has passed away?
Yeah, so I try to set that up on the first time that I'm meeting this group or this family or the inner circle, whoever's going to be with the client, because I want to pre-educate them that they're going to be functioning in that matter. And so just the awareness of, you know, if I'm in this headspace, what kind of decisions am I making then versus how do I feel now, and when we're having this discussion up front. And so oftentimes you can just remind them, like, remember when we talked about this?
Yeah.
Now it's happening, you know, because it does change. Everything changes after somebody dies. So, you know, but still, people still fight. Again, people are going to people. You can't change who they are, but you can educate.
Sure. Okay, well, let's talk about that. So when you take on a client, and let's say it's their idea jointly with their partner, but now they want to bring in, say, their adult children. Is everybody always happy to be there? Hey, come on by. We're meeting with my death doula.
No, some people literally hate me, which is fine. It's not about me. I'm not the harbinger. You know, I'm just a professional, but I understand.
I mean, you're not a harbinger, but it's not. I can put myself in their shoes. And, you know.
Yeah, no, I get it. If we're denying death as a coping mechanism, the person who's here to talk about death is your least favorite person.
Yeah.
So some kids, I've had people scream, walk out of the room, yell at me, you know, but I get it. It's a part of the process. But I think one of the hardest things is when people decide to stop treatment. And that's when people get really angry that they didn't try enough and they didn't, you know, do this or do that. And it's like, you weren't going through the treatment. You don't know what it's like. And none of us know. So, you know, that's where I'm coming from. I don't get involved with family squabbles, but I do understand why people get, you know, angry at me.
Are you familiar with the concept of Swedish death cleaning?
Yes.
Okay. I gather Amy Poehler developed a TV show about it.
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know if it's actually been made.
Okay.
So it's a thing that I only heard of yesterday. Yeah. What is Swedish death cleaning?
One of my clients would call it de-nesting.
Right. And that's sort of the joke about it is what's the difference? Because my parents are of a certain age and there's don't give me any more stuff. I've already got too much stuff. Here, take this. Here, take this.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm hopefully, God willing, not facing death anytime soon. And I feel like I'm already decluttering. What's the difference between decluttering and Swedish death cleaning?
Well, possessions are one of the things that add to meaning making and the denial of death. So, and we see this with hoarders, right? A lot of times hoarders are people that have experienced very complicated grief. And so they hold on to every single thing that they possibly can to make them feel safe. So death cleaning is kind of like a version of starting to let go of these possessions over time, or all at once if you know you have a diagnosis. I think the concept of minimalism is catching on now more than ever. Yeah. So that's kind of nice because I've dealt with a lot of hoarders and a lot of like cluttered houses.
Yeah, I was going to say the Container Store still seems like they're doing pretty well. Marie Kondo's got a
Junk
pretty good
removal, career
auctions, growth. Yeah. A lot of people are still holding on to a lot. Target still seems pretty busy.
Yeah, and I do work with professional organizers and professional like declutterers to help with this process after or even before.
Yeah. Many of us, perhaps most of us, have people in our lives, older relatives, who would not be open to having death doulas when the time of their passing approaches. We obviously can't replace what you do, but what tips can we take from what you've learned and your techniques to be sort of mini death doulas to our loved ones?
I mean, just follow the lead of the dying person, as hard as that sounds, because some people don't even want hospice care because that's the H word, and that killed their mother with morphine or whatever. People get these, you know, they weave stories together after intense experiences. So, you know, if you don't have a doula, if you can, try to get in touch with a palliative care team, you know, just to talk about options and treatment at the same time. So there's an even conversation. But also, you know, so palliative care and hospice are pros at talking about this. Yeah. So typically, though, it's just such a fast-paced environment. They might not have the time or the staff to take that time with you, which is why there's a gap for doulas. But there's still good medical staff out there.
Do you feel like there are other cultures, obviously in terms of assisted death or euthanasia, we've talked about other cultures that have more open-minded views about, being accepting of that and embracing that. But there's this cliche that, in the West, we can't deal with it. And then there's always this beautiful idea of Eastern mysticism that they're perfectly well adjusted and everybody's, internalized a bunch of sayings from Confucius.
Yeah.
What are things that we can read or think about or do to, it's one of these things I don't know. You use the example of a woman giving birth. You go to Lamaze classes, and I'm sure it's very helpful. Nothing will prepare you, but if the alternative is blocking it out of your mind and pretending it's not going to happen to you until it's too late, what can or should we be doing while we still have the time and the faculties to make our peace with the inevitability of death?
I guess I want to bring Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in at this point.
Okay.
Because she talks about and did, pragmatic research on the dying and found these patterns of what people experience while they're going through the dying process. And typically the last one is acceptance. But some people don't get to acceptance until they're in their unconscious dying phase. So there's really nothing you can do to get people towards that point. They have to reach it themselves. And whether that takes place while they're still kind of earthbound or in their liminal space before they die is really more so up to them. Does that make sense?
Sort of. But that's a person who's sort of already in the process. How should I be thinking about the fact that I am going to die someday and that my loved ones are going to die, and it's a natural part of life in the same way. We're not going to celebrate their death in the same way that we celebrate the birth of a child or something like that, but to embrace it as a natural, to make it less of a boogeyman, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah,
I think a lot of it is kind of ego slashing, right? Why me? Why not you? You absolutely could die today. Have you thought of that? It's most people won't go there. But I think exercising a muscle, there might be a way to exercise I'm a fragile being. Today could be the last day. Am I happy with where I'm at? How can I make the present, a heaven space? The present is the good space for you.
Well, okay, maybe I think my last question is just sort of a different way of asking the same question. You've been really present with any number of people at the moment of their passing. Are there commonalities that you see in terms of the sorts of lives that you think people led who have good deaths versus the people who maybe have bad deaths?
Well, there's two categories of dyers, I guess I should say, because remember, good or bad is kind of in the hands of the dyer. But some people are passive and some people cling. Some people are controlling, stubborn, and some people are whoop, I'm just going to go. I'm just going to go with it. I'm just going to die. And some people really hang on. For whatever reason, it's a part of their personality. It's that energetic flow they've had their entire life. They're not used to letting go, giving up. And, just allowing that. Those are the patterns that I see, is that people are kind of one way or the other. And you can kind of see what it's going to be just by learning about their personality and their history and their life.
Well, so that's sort of what I'm getting at, is if we want to the extent that it is within our control, and very often I'm sure it would not be, what are things we can address within ourselves in the living years, so to speak, we all want to feel a sense of peace and completion at the end of our lives. We want the novel to have a decent ending. So what are the things that can make us not be the person who's holding on?
Yeah, it's hard to answer. And it's also a part of my job not to give these direct answers, because that's up to you. I can't make that happen for you. I can't give you a script that's going to get you there. You have to sit and evaluate your own life and what equals happiness for you. You know, our definitions of happiness are going to be totally different. So, you know, that's why a great reason to hire a doula is giving people the time to talk about what matters and then spending what time they have if they haven't thought about it before.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for your time. Are there any books or resources you would recommend that people?
Yes.
The Tibetan Book of Death and Dying is BS, right?
I mean,
Just some guy wrote it in the 80s or whatever.
It's a good book. But you know, you have to be more theologically inclined to read something like that because it is more of a religious text. I would say for people who want to know more about the denial of death, there's a great book by Sheldon Solomon called The Worm at the Core. It expands on Kierkegaard's and Becker's work on the denial of death using social experiments to prove that people act differently when faced with mortality. So that's a really good one. Also, Sheldon Solomon is still a professor at Skidmore College, so he's among us. You know, he's someone who can talk now about this stuff. I'm also a big fan of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Obviously, there's On Death and Dying, but there's another great one called Dying, the Final Stage of Growth, which is all client-patient narratives and what dying is like for them. And so if you really want to dig into the dying experience, that's a great book.
All right. Thank you. And for people who want to know more about you and your work, they can go to deathdoulala.com.
Yes.
That's right. Thank you so much for your time, Jill.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jill Schock. More importantly, we hope it gave you some food for thought, a couple of potential takeaways. What are the sorts of things we can do during the living years to help ensure a sense of completion and finality and perhaps even peace when we reach the end? Also, I will confess I was a little disappointed. I was hoping somebody who has spent so much time physically and emotionally and spiritually present at the time of other people's passing might have a little bit more insight into the possible existence of the human soul or transcendence. Maybe the fact that she's not even sure about that stuff tells us everything we need to know. But we'd like to hear what you think. What are things we can do during our lives to help ensure a quote-unquote good death? And what happens to us after we die? Leave your answers to those questions in the comments, and we'd also love to hear the sorts of guests you'd like to hear and see here in the future. Until then, I'm Mike Tully. This has been the Aperture Podcast.
The world is a big and confusing place. Every day we're bombarded with ideas, opinions, information, and misinformation, all of which only